My whole goal is to drive operational excellence, but operational excellence is part of EH&S, or EHS is part of operational excellence if you do it appropriately. It shouldn't be siloed and separate. It should be together.
Welcome to the Canary Report, the podcast where risk leaders, safety professionals, and operational executives come for real-world stories and smarter strategies to keep people safe. I'm your host, Michael Zal. In each episode, I sit down with exceptional leaders who are transforming how risk and safety are managed. Whether you're a leader of a nationwide EH&S program in a high-risk industry, or you champion workplace safety across 200 retail locations, this podcast is for you. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Canary Report, a podcast where risk leaders, safety professionals, and operational executives come for real-world stories and smarter strategies to keep people safe. I'm your host, Michael Zal, the founder and CEO of Yellowbird. Today, joining us from Tampa, Florida, is David Payton, the Vice President of EHS at TSC Construction. And giving you a little bit of background around David, and I always tell our guests that they're going to be embarrassed because nobody likes to talk about themselves, but I love to talk about them. So he's got 20 years of experience in commercial and residential real estate development. He's been in telecommunications. He's been in Maritime. He's been in construction. He's built a career on operational excellence. He's a proactive safety leader. He's extremely well respected in the industry. His early days of operations and to executive leadership roles have pretty much distinguished him as somebody who can combine his technical knowledge, his strong relationships, and being a problem solver. Today's conversation is going to cover TSC, some of the overseas safety operations and nationwide safety operations, including his 15 technical safety technicians, 4 training centers, and a whole bunch more around rigging, rescue, critical training, and other things. So, and most importantly, I am looking forward to hearing about you as a human being and your family. And so welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me, David.
All right. Thanks, Michael. And as you said, you probably did overstate my my awesomeness, but I appreciate the help there.
I don't know if I can overstate your awesomeness. You are an awesome individual, but I love that description. So that's fantastic. So, well, first and foremost, I think it's important that people understand, and this is the reason we do the podcast, is understand who you are as a human being. Letting you know a little bit about myself, because I think it's always good to kind of level set. You and I are very similar stages of life. We talked about that before we came on. Your kids, your marriage, your career. You're one of the few like myself who's been married 20 some odd years with a great partner. So please tell me about your family first and foremost, and maybe a little bit about what they're up to these days.
Well, I'm a father of 3, a husband of 1. As far as my wife's concerned, no.
Love it.
So been married 23 years. I'd consider myself pretty standard average guy as far as, kind of faith, family, fun, right? And just keep those things in order in life. Keep laughing at it. Keep living. 2 kids in college. 1 graduating high school this year. So almost verging an empty nester, or at least self-taking care of syndrome, since they don't leave quite as early as they used to.
Yes, exactly.
So that's, and then finding a woman to put up with me for this long, probably one of my greatest achievements.
I understand that very, very well. And what are your kids in college? Are they local or did they go away? And what are they studying?
We have one that's stayed at home, a little bit smarter. He wants to save his money. So he stayed at home studying the economy and going into financial services. The daughter, she wanted to get away. So she's only 25 minutes, but decided to stay on campus, probably for a little less rules in her life. And she's actually studying ecology. And my third one, he is not going to go to college. He's going to go to HVAC and trades and get his license and apprenticeship.
Fantastic. I love that, by the way. And I'm proud of him and you for embracing that, because we need more people embracing that journey. It's a needed and very valuable journey that I wish more people would be open to going into the trades, because I think it's just a wonderful way to make a living, make a life, and contribute to society. So congratulations. I did the same thing. I don't know if he did it to, my son was opposite when it came to going away 25 minutes away. My son went just down 25 minutes away as well, but my wife and I had a conversation with him and said, well, you're still going away to college, because he is more of a homebody, and we wanted him to experience college. And I think he would have been happy to stay at home, maybe too happy. And so that first year, we took his car away, and he was not happy about that. Like, you are literally 25 minutes away, and I do not want to see you. That being said, now he's a junior studying architecture, and he's doing great. And he does come home, but he comes home to visit mostly the dog, to be honest with you. He loves our dog. It's funny. He runs in, he hugs the dog, he plays with the dog. He goes, "Oh, hi, mom and dad." Yeah.
Byproduct. Yeah.
Yeah. So we happen to feed him food, and make sure that he's taken care of, so he tolerates us. So give me a little bit of an understanding of your journey as in your career. So you've been through a lot of different roles, and you and I have a lot of backgrounds. I actually worked very closely with one of your past employers at Ericsson for many, many years, probably in a different division than you were in. But tell me about just kind of your journey through the safety and other roles.
Yeah, so my wife will tell you that I get bored easy, so I always look for something else to get into. It seems like, I started back in the day on my tools as an iron worker. Went through journeyman and got into running work. Funny story is my wife saw me. She pulled up to go to lunch with me. I was about 200 feet in the air, walking on a small I-beam. That's before fall protection was required. And she was pregnant with our first child, and she instructed me that our children need a father, so I need to figure out something else. So I started figuring out how to run work versus be the person, 200-300 feet in the air walking without being tied off and stuff. And started became a foreman, became a superintendent, then started a GC work where I would build, prisons, stadiums, high rises, things like that. So just kind of hospitals. So yeah, I did a lot of big projects where I'd have to move from state to state every couple of years, and just worked my way through the operations side of life, where got into managing operations from a construction level. And then one day, just my journey turned into EHS. Interesting enough story was just real quick. We had our leader at that time, the global, was they tried to extradite him for manslaughter in Australia.
Oh, wow.
He made a firm swipe across all 70 countries that we worked in, saying that you'll have a VP of EHS. And I was doing military work at the time, and they just reached down the hallway and said, "Hey, David, you're doing military work, so you understand all these process procedures and rules, right?" And I said, "Yeah, unfortunately." He said, "Well, how do you feel about VP of EH&S?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, I understand EH&S, but I'm not going to say that I am the technical, or I have a lot of technical background in operations on how to build stuff, right? You want to talk about harmonic vibrations and things like that. I understand all that, but had to do a little bit more digging on the EHS side. But that threw me into the EHS side, and had multiple countries to cover there. And then I enjoyed it. I liked it, and realized the kind of difference I could make because of my operational experience. It was
Yes.
easier for me to talk to a CEO and about P&L and all those different things, because I've lived it, right? I understand the estimating, the bidding, all the things that an operations person needs to hear to get them to understand that environmental health and safety is important to how profitable we are as a company, how much risk we reduce as a company, and those type of things. So, so with that company, we had construction services, we had manufacturing, we manufactured drill rigs and cranes and things like that. So, uh, and then switched into my career, went into maritime, and did kind of the same thing. Maritime is a very high risk industry. They're probably still one of the most high risk industries I say TRIR there is probably 3 times higher than it is in construction or any other industry.
It is.
And took my experience there the same way, even challenging the operational ways of doing things. So I would be over continual improvement for
Mhm.
operational things, value stream mapping, and I use that as my platform to tie in EHS to operational things, right? And my whole goal is to drive operational excellence, but operational excellence is part of EH&S, or EHS is part of operational excellence if you do it appropriately. It shouldn't be siloed and separate. It should be together.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. So in maritime, can you give me, well, first of all, the first role that you were in, I want to ask you, so it was an international construction firm, correct? And you mentioned manslaughter. So I assume he was in Australia or somewhere that actually holds executives to legal, with if I so I want to talk about that so we can put a pencil in that, a pin in that for a moment. But on the maritime side, can you explain to me and our listeners, there's so many areas of maritime. So can you, where in the sea-based, vessel-based world were you?
So I was part of a holding company and we had 5 different companies. So I had environmental remediation. We had an actual environmental company that did environmental remediation on the water, off the water. So it might be Butterworthing an 800 foot oil tanker, cleaning it out and then taking all the oil and stuff and remediating that through a wastewater treatment system. We had a shipbuilding repair company, which, people don't think about it, but it's funny sometimes when you think, how does a 300-foot ship get hit by a 900-foot ship in the middle of an ocean that has so much room and space? But it happens. So you might come in there and, I mean, we had a Coast Guard cutter come in and we got hit by a ship and we cut the last, 50 foot of a ship off. And then it's like putting a new bumper on a car, but you're just doing it on a really big piece of steel, right?
Very dangerous work. The very, very dangerous work.
And we also had the terminal side where we did terminal company where, ship come in, we offload rice, sugar, whatever it is, and then load back on to another shipment or load it out. If this is a final destination, we'd load it out to things. So I covered multiple areas in the maritime industry that kept it interesting.
So how did you, sticking to that for a moment, and then we'll keep on going with your journey, but how did you manage? There's a lot of moving parts in that maritime operation. You're talking about, not only getting the vessels into a facility that can be worked on, had to have fall protection, I imagine, a ton of rigging, ton of heavy equipment. You also had to deal with, the labor pool has to be very different than your traditional labor pool. How are you managing the training and the supervision and all of that stuff just in the various different stages and places that you're working with? Like, what did it look like from an operational perspective on EHS?
Honestly, it was very difficult at first because I would say, the maritime industry was probably, 10 to 20 years behind. So they just kind of were like, get in there and figure it out type of industry. Right. So to establish, like I started to establish like full training programs and stuff like that. And they had certain things that were required, like, a standard confined space in construction and stuff like that. You get a qualified person to go in there and do that, it's fine. In the maritime industry, you got to have an actual marine chemist to certify spaces, right? And the marine chemist trains your people to also look at spaces that are certifiable by, to an extent by your qualified people. But there's other times where it has to be marine chemist first because there's so many VOCs, volatile organic compounds that come through the maritime industry with all the different, I mean, the whole thing is a big, 1,000-foot confined space separated in, hundreds of compartments.
Yes. And so like the maritime chemist or the marine chemist, who's that's not, is it under Department of Labor and OSHA, or are they under a different, is maritime under a different jurisdiction?
That's the fun, tough thing about maritime is they have so many different issues, right? If you're not tied to the land, right? You've got the CFR 33, which is Coast Guard based, and
Right.
it's really heavily regulated by the Coast Guard. If you're
Okay.
tied to land, you have both the OSHA and Coast Guard regulations that you have to follow. But the marine chemist kind of falls under that Coast Guard regulation and
Okay.
OSHA regulations as far as like CFR 40 and then the
Right.
1919, 1917, and all those
Sure.
fun maritime numbers that go with it. So yeah, it is even the way you do simple things like electrical, right?
Right.
The maritime has a whole different standard than you would have in a standard electrical if you built the buildings on the port versus the ship and the water. So it creates some intricacies when it comes to training and keeping up with standards and who does your inspecting, right?
How is that? Like, who does do the inspections?
A
Both
U.S.
in
Coast Guard.
U.S. Coast
The
Guard.
Coast Guard has the vet. I mean, we have, owners reps and things like that that always do inspections, but the
Right.
regulatory body is the Coast Guard. It comes and does the vessel inspections, even like your how you handle hazards. So, like, let's say your spill control measures and all that kind of stuff. The Coast Guard comes in annually and does tabletop exercises and make sure that you can handle if you had an environmental spill on the water, right? Which people will be surprised how often can happen if you get a hole in a ballast tank and you shoot out ballast water, but it's really shooting out, 250 gallons of diesel fuel into a bay. It becomes problematic.
Problematic. That is an understatement. Yes. And you and I could have this discussion for hours and hours because, are you from, Yellowbird? And I think you might be working with us or will hopefully at some point. It's not the purpose of this conversation, but I always talk about how people are like, oh, I have a safety guy. This is the reason that nobody has a safety guy. It's like there's no such thing as a universal safety guy. There's not a cloak that you throw on and all of a sudden you're the superhero EHS expert. It is a very, very complex ecosystem. As you've just described an even more complex ecosystem because I normally don't deal with maritime and the Coast Guard and all of the other things that you have to deal with as well. Although I wrote a note because it might be an interesting opportunity for Yellowbird to pursue and find who's qualified to do that kind of work. I'm always thinking about how do we identify, vet, and make sure that somebody's qualified to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
And especially if they're no longer in, sometimes if you were a professional, you'd be a perfect professional on Yellowbird to go into a maritime environment to give guidance. But often people do what you did, which is after you got out of that, what was your next step? You went into Ericsson, correct? Was that
Yep. So
Yep.
yeah, I switched over into telecommunications. First
Right.
onto that to kind of like what you said, right? I didn't know about maritime either until I jumped into it.
Sure.
And then telecommunications kind of the same. And I found that like both maritime and telecommunications kind of follow the same pattern. They're both niche industries, right? That are kind of, yeah, they're kind of small in who handles it, right? And but very niche as far as how it's been regulated and what's been going on, things like that. Like if you look at OSHA standards for telecommunications, are almost non-existent.
I know.
So it was interesting going into, an Ericsson, large global company, I think 180 countries. So it was interesting, just running globally telecommunication wise and moving into telecommunications that doesn't really have, set standards. So you're really creating best practices a lot of times, trying to go off of other industry standards like construction and 1910, 1926, and trying to correlate and tell people, hey, we get it that you don't really have specific written rules here, but they still apply. Right.
Now, from that perspective, so because Ericsson is Ericsson, they're so massive and they do so many different things from manufacturing of the equipment to professional services to installations and consulting. The Ericsson, people don't realize how absolutely impactful Ericsson as a company is. Were you part of all of that, or were you in a subdivision?
Yeah. So I handled all the operations for North America. So for Canada and the US and Puerto Rico. So I handled all that. We got to do some cool things like you talking about manufacturing. We built the first 5G smart factory there in Texas, and that was neat. It's like walking into Star Wars. I tell them you look at R2D2 rolling around, and all that kind of stuff, and robots that are not supposed to bump into you or bump into doors, and setting all that whole system up was interesting to watch.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the division I used to work with many, many moons ago. I was in the satellite communications and telecom industry and that's how I got into safety, is through dealing with FEMA and AT&T FirstNet and things like that, where very dangerous environments and
Yeah, disaster recovery and all that good stuff.
disaster recovery, and all the cows, which you
Yeah.
guys were building, Cell on Wheels, for those who are not from the industry. They're basically trailerized data centers slash and towers that will restore communication after a disaster and where something doesn't exist. And I did that for many, many years. And so you've got towers, you've got electrical, a lot of high power. So in that environment, so was your training program internal? How were you guys managing that, especially on the things that had to be done with OSHA 500 that had to sign off on, if you're doing an OSHA 30 class, you have to have an OSHA 500 person doing it. If you're doing an on vehicle certification for OSHA, you need to have somebody actually on that vehicle for like a forklift or something. So how did you do that with the number of humans that were touching all that equipment?
Yeah, I mean, we were pretty invested in what we call the center of excellences, and that's where we would send everybody through. Like it was automatic. The first week of employment,
Right.
you were going to one of those places and you were spending it doesn't matter how qualified you were or how many certifications you already had, you were going through a week of training just to see what you knew, what was going on, and send you through that type of training to make sure that you had everything from DOT to climbing, rescuing to the OSHA courses, all that, rigging courses, everything. So yeah, we had centers of excellence that we used for that.
Yeah, I remember those very well. In fact, you used to send subcontractors for some of those when and that's actually impressive. Very big investment. Uh, that's a huge investment for a company to do that. Just the travel and stay, and it's
Oh
a
yeah.
massive, and
It
people
was
don't
roughly
realize.
around $35,000 a person is what we calculated it out to. So you're investing 35 grand a person, hoping they
Wow.
worked out, because if they didn't, you just lost that money.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is insane. I've never talked to somebody who actually had a calculation around what that expense was. That's massive. It's funny because a lot of times folks are saying, "Oh, well, we need to do forklift type training for our entire staff in person," and we're like, "Oh, it's going to be $200 a person." They're like, "Oh, that's really expensive." It's like now you hear $35,000 to run somebody through this program. You better hope they stay.
Right. Exactly.
That tells you a lot. Okay, so you were there and you went through that journey, and then and
Then
how? Where are you now? Or
Yeah,
what's
now
what?
I'm with TSC. I was actually going to get out altogether and go into insurance in the risk role.
Yeah.
And TSC called me up and said, "Hey, do you mind?" And I said, "Well, because they're a largest supplier of Ericsson, and I told them, I said, just check with Ericsson first, make sure I don't cause any waves, doing this." They checked with them. They came in, talked to me, and it was a good fit for me personally. Me and the owners aligned very well, and they came in, and the good thing is, like TSC, when I was with Ericsson, I got to help guide them on their journey before I even came to work with them. Because we actually have TSC, we actually have training centers the same way. We have training centers throughout the US where we do the same thing. We train our own people, and we also train our subcontractors to ensure that they get what we feel is the right type of training.
That's awesome. So tell me about TSC. Tell me about the business, what you do. For those who are not familiar with, a lot of people don't understand the telecommunications piece of the world, how intricate, and they're like, oh, it's wireless. It just this phone, it just works, and it's like you don't realize the number of cables and the amount of power and the amount of maintenance and climbing and all of that goes into it. So
Yeah, it's
tell
kind
me
of
what
like when you
TSC.
said it's kind of like when you said cow. Unless you're from the industry, you don't really
Right.
know what a cow is. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's a lot. So I consider telecom. TSC is telecom construction. We get into civil work, right? Concrete, drill piers, steel, things like that, and then of course the installation of the cabinets, the hybrid cables, the antennas, the radios that keep connectivity going throughout the U.S. And it is, like you said, it's intricate because it's usually a small footprint, right? But there's a lot goes in a small footprint, and you got people that are climbing 300 foot in the air, dragging cables, antennas, and radios, and setting them up there, and in precise, very sensitive equipment. The fiber optics and stuff like that could have just a little dust on it. Now you got to clean it to get everything correctly. Azimuths that have to be, within a certain degree, so it's projecting out the signal the right way, so that Michael and David don't lose our signal once we're 20 foot away from a tower. Uh, in coverage, because as soon as there's no coverage, first thing people do is call and complain, hey, I don't have any coverage here, but I'm paying monthly to have coverage. So, and the intricacies, like people don't understand, is you're also looking, your emergency services run off these systems. So if a system is down, you have 911 calls, ambulatory calls that can't be received, right? And your emergency communication systems can't be used if these systems are down. So it's very critical. Like during COVID, we got the critical infrastructure waiver and stamp of approval to be out there, because it's important that people can communicate, especially during COVID. It
Yes.
was super important that connectivity stayed intact in the US.
It was quite interesting you should say that. So you brought up a few things. I'm going to try not to go too far down this rabbit hole, because you touched on my past life that I am a subject matter expert in. And so I'm going to try not to become too much of a geek. But I was actually started in fiber optics in 1995, 96. And you're old enough, like I am, to remember those days. But a lot of folks don't realize that was the infancy of the internet. People were like, "Oh, it's just a fad. It's not going to work." Right? It's like I'm not going to put my catalog on the internet. People can they buy me. They buy my services.
Yeah. Took
They
so
want
long to use, even you
right.
could you could run and get a reference card from the library, be faster than dialing up, sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, I was doing international a lot back in those days. And then I eventually got into satellite communication. And TDMA satellite works exactly or very, very similarly to TDMA networks that you run on. And TDMA is time division multiplexing algorithm, basically. But it's essentially sharing spectrum. And so the reason that we can all talk on our cell phones and you have an oversubscription ratio, because Ericsson makes the equipment that allows you to share that spectrum over multiple phones. And so there's a ratio of how many phones to how many, to how much frequency. And as technology gets better, you get more phones per frequency, which makes the carriers more efficient. And so Ericsson is the driver of a lot of that efficiency and how they make money. But the reason I bring this up is I imagine during COVID, and I've never talked to anybody about this. I imagine during COVID, all the models changed, because if you've ever been stuck on the freeway or the highway, and the vehicles all stop, and then all of a sudden you can't make a phone call, it's because they're designed to have you go by at 60 miles an hour. And so you're dropping a signal or jumping to the next, system. And then the guy behind you that's driving at 60 miles an hour is picking that up and is dynamically doing it using the equipment. Well, now you've got a whole bunch of people that are on their cell phones static. They're not moving. And so the ratios of how many phone calls to how much. So I imagine you were very busy installing and expanding and sending people out and hiring contractors and doing all that stuff. And so going back to the discussion at hand, so during that journey, were you at uh, 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 TSC at that point, and during COVID, or were you still Ericsson at that point?
I was at Ericsson, kind of like you said, where everybody else was like slowing down and putting on the brakes, and they're all like, it sped everything up for us. We were probably, even more busy, super busy, trying to get that stuff done. Like you talked about, they even, realized things like, spectrum splicing, right? Where if you're only doing 30 mile an hour and you only need, this much room, well, somebody else can use whatever's left over there, and they start looking at that high band, low band, mid band, and deciding how much can be on that and how much somebody else can use of what you have unused, and they start that slicing thing. And I was like, I didn't even know, because you think about it in ethereal terms, like you can't see it, so how do you slice it, type deal. But yeah, so we were really busy because a lot of systems got overloaded, right? Everybody kind of found their limits, like streaming platforms and stuff like that. Everybody were finding, oh, we had limits that we didn't know we had, because now everybody needs to use it. So you're looking at, you go from a partial load to a max load capacity on a lot of systems. So it definitely showed you the breaking point of some systems where they thought they were okay.
Yeah. So in that scenario, going to the safety world, so then you're deploying people to go and upgrade these systems, and it's dynamically happening. You're using subcontractors a lot, I imagine, as well as your own employees. You're only running those folks through your training excellence centers at initial hire and then occasionally, but as you're in this crunch mode, how do you handle, you're nationwide, right? You guys do work nationwide.
Yes.
And how many facilities do you have as kind of your different areas?
Training center locations?
No, I just mean in general, well, training centers, but also employees, and like how many employees do y'all have within reason? Of course, I don't know if you know all the intricate details, but also just like if you're in all the states, from California to Maine, uh, how many, where are your teams, and then how do you handle search?
So we have 23 markets that we're in, which might be one state or multiple states, depending on the market. Like we say KMO, that's Kansas and Missouri. Um, and we try to strategically place like a location that's centralized in those areas. So we'll have like 15 locations. And we try to create those as hubs. So if somebody needs to come to a hub, right, that's the goal. Start them out at a hub, teach them, train them, move them out from there. And then also, if we find, trends and indicators that say, hey, we need a little shoring up on this, we have multiple options where people can come to us, or mobile options where we take a certain SME, right, subject matter expert, we send them to your location. So we have a flexible way of doing things where it just depends on the size of the need, and just, of course, like anything else, cost,
Right.
level of effort,
Sure.
whether you come to us or we come to you.
Right.
And we have mobile SMEs that say, hey, you know what? I realize we're going to start up a new market, and in
Yeah.
this new market, we'd like to have a subject matter expert for construction, for installation, for whatever. We're going to send them to that area.
Yep.
They're going to spend time with each of these subcontractors in that area,
Right.
and until they feel comfortable and secure. And then we'll move them to a different area where we feel like either we have issues or we're starting up another new market. So
Right.
we have a very fluid and flexible business plan to make sure that that's successful. And then, of course, both we have physical and remote support. So we create structures where we have both physical and remote support with the same level of intelligence, right? You might have a civil engineer, an electrical engineer, an RF engineer, remote support for a field team, because the field person might not know it, be a subject matter expert and everything. So we got to have the remote support teams to fill in for the physical teams and help them out. So it's kind of a conglomeration of needs and assessments and things like that. But we have the ability to either have a established place or make it all mobile.
So it's so interesting. My dream, we are not as big of a company as you are. We've got about, roughly 6,000, coming on 7,000 professionals on the platform across the country. And they've got different, and when I say professionals, they're all EHS people. we don't do anything except environmental health and safety and loss control. And loss control is kind of an overlay because, as you mentioned, you were going to go into insurance. There's a possibility, most of the people who are in insurance and risk management come from an EHS background because those are the big risk, especially on work comp and property. But my dream is to have established a network that is exactly what you're talking about on the SME for all these other trades or skills or competencies for safety, where you can say, we can coordinate a training facility for you and have one of our pros go there. We can do pop-ins on a weekly basis. So we do surveys and assessments and oversight. You need somebody who's actually there to make sure that you're doing things safely for 90 days. We do that. We're doing that kind of work at a small scale now, which is exciting and fun. But my dream is to actually, what you just described, I hope that Yellowbird will get there with an organization like yours or somebody else's that can say, all right, when we have these subject matter experts, we're going to, or roll out a site, we're going to set up a cadence of training for fall protection or confined space or electrical, hazardous materials or arc flash or all that kind of stuff. Do you do that internally on your SMEs for EHS, covering all of these? Well, you said 24.
For all our market areas, yeah, we have our own LMS platform. We create our own training, and we'll use the SMEs to help. So if I create right now, one of the ones we're finishing up is a QEW training. Right, we'll have electrical engineers as part of that, and then actual journeyman or master electricians that are a part of that internally with our company, and we'll create that ourselves, and then we'll figure out. Right now I'm focused on setting up all the practical testing solutions in each training center so that, once we have the training portion done, that they have a place to do practical testing and verify that knowledge. So yeah, we do most everything internally.
Now, have you found that it's that you're using the same instructors for all of them, or are you generally saying, I'm going to have, if you're doing, as an example, on the electrical, having somebody who's an electrical trainer that does the electrical at your training facilities, are you flying your electrical safety experts to the different training facilities, or are you staffing electrical, heights, equipment, guarding, HAZCOM, fire, NFPA, separate individuals for each of those at each of your facilities? Because that could be, that's a massive investment.
Yeah, no, we try to just make our trainers smarter. So the goal is, if you're a trainer, the goal is we send you through electrical training. You get, some of them already have it, right? Like we have trainers that were journeyman electricians.
Sure.
So, but we'll send you through the training that you need to be to deliver the course that you do with practical experience, not just going to a train the trainer course, but actually comprehend and understand the subject matter. And so that's our goal is, we invest a lot into a few people. So it's one of those things that when you do that, you got to do it the right way. Cause it's not easy to reproduce those people, but, that's the goal, is have one that can teach many versus have many that can teach one.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and we kind of look at it differently, because we have our trainers that are subject matter experts on the platform, but they are actually potentially not always doing that for us. They're doing it for their own company sometimes. They're doing it for somebody else, but they are 30-year electrical safety trainers, and that's what they've done in electrical only. Ideal. And then if somebody says, okay, I need a fall from heights person, well, maybe I had the former head of training for 3M do it rather than somebody, and which is not always the right, you've got to figure out. I always say sometimes the best subject matter experts are not the best teachers.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're the ones who should be writing the curriculum, but not necessarily teaching the curriculum.
Correct.
Right? Like, and so like we actually have people who use us for creating the curriculum, And then they'll also use us using somebody different for creating testing methodologies or practical
Yeah.
methodologies. Kind of like what you're doing now. If you ever outsource that, we'd be a good methodology to help you kind of get that thing done. But then you have to say, okay, well, how am I going to test in the field throughout the year to have somebody go and do a pop-in and make sure people are actually applying what they've learned? And so it's just, I love this industry because we've just in this conversation covered, I mean, huge amount of range of need, and people are like, oh, I got a safety guy. And then you have this conversation, you're like, oh, now I get it. Okay, now I understand. It's like sometimes folks don't really even understand why this is such a great opportunity. Investors and employees and even customers that use us. It's like, I know how hard it is to do this job. It is hard. So, and we're gonna wrap because we're coming up on the end of time, and we could probably talk forever, which I love, David. And thank you for being here and doing this. I've really enjoyed this conversation. As we wrap up, if you had to think of the most challenging thing that you contend with, you've done a fantastic job, and your company is obviously extremely high caliber. But what's the hardest part of the program that you run? Like when you think about all these things, what, in your opinion, is the most challenging thing that a VP of EHS for a telecom contractor? What's the hardest piece of the equation?
I think the hardest piece of the equation is operational integration. And that is to say that most people struggle with implementation because of operational integration, meaning that if you don't learn how to tie in EH&S to operational excellence, right? Meaning this is just the way our business operates. If you don't learn how to tie that in, typically most EHS people that I know get frustrated because they're like, I can't get my ops to implement and put these things into place, right? So I think it's twofold: is we can't silo it, right? We got to put it as, I tell people all the time, I don't use the word safety, I use the word risk, right? Here's our risk, because I manage risk as well and have managed risk for years on the insurance side. So I manage risk, which means to them I'm managing the risk to people, the risk to property, the risk to everything. So I manage risk so people aren't defensive about safety, right? And then I
Right.
say, you don't have safety events, safety issues. You have operational failures. When you
Right.
fail to rig something appropriately, it's not a safety issue. It's an operational failure because we taught you how to rig, right? If you run a crane and you run it into something, that's not a safety incident. That's an operational failure because you're certified to run that crane and do those things. So it's about how you create your system and how you get it ingrained in operation. And listen, you have to teach operational people. Like when they say, "Hey, this is your problem," I'll be like, "No, I didn't create your construction plan for you."
Right.
So the fact that you had a construction plan, it wasn't followed, right? Those are just operational failures. So I put it in as, this is how we do business from an operational standpoint. EHS, just like quality, just like anything else, right? They don't separate that. All of it goes to the P&L. All of it goes to how successful, how big of margins we have. So it's an operational thing, and that's where I put it in. And I think that's the biggest roadblock most EHS people get into, because they get an EHS mindset instead of a business mindset. But once you learn how to tie that in and explain it to everybody, then it becomes, this is just the way we do business. And I don't have a silo EHS. It is just part of what we do. When I do executive interviews, I do it with the owners and we do it together. So when we interview a company, it's an executive interview I do with the owners, just to say, "Hey, do you even meet the rank to come work with us? Do your cultures or your values align?" Because those aren't separate from EHS or operations. It's all together.
So do you have a separate budget on your internal operations? And do you have a separate budget on your subcontractor operations for safety training and oversight? I know most contracts have the requirement to have a safety manager on site and to have a safety supervisor, but most people are using their general superintendent, and they throw an OSHA 30 on them, and they're like, okay, you're now the safety manager as well, which is not always the greatest strategy. But that it's better than nothing, of course.
Yeah.
But that being said, how do you manage that from a budgetary perspective internally?
So from a budget, we almost look at it as so whatever staffed there, of course, goes to the EHS, and certain specific line items of equipment and things like that go. But we try to have a balance of operational responsibility, accountability,
Sure.
and even crew accountability when it comes to the EHS stuff. So there are some things that are EHS related, but operational costed.
Right.
And then there are some things that we have that are EHS and they're tracked as EHS only. So it's a little bit of a mix. And then training itself, right? Like even our trainers, they go out into the field on Fridays. That's to verify training implemented versus what was taught and planned. So we have some separation and some that I would call commingling of funds, but it'll mostly go to a operational cost and then some costed out.
You are a wealth of knowledge. I could talk to you probably for 5 hours. We're gonna have to do a series with you covering some of this stuff. I've enjoyed this immensely, and I'm going to make absolutely certain that people have your LinkedIn on the podcast and reference to your wonderful company. You guys have obviously done a great job. I commend your leadership, honestly, because having somebody like you and having an organization that actually values the importance of this stuff, not just because it has to be done from an insurance and legal perspective, but also because obviously that the culture is worth investing in the people, keep them safe. And
that is what really probably makes my job easier, and every company, feels the same. But the fact that the leadership is bought in, and I don't hear a lot of no's, David, or as long as I have logic and can prove out the theories and do it, my leadership is all for do what you need to do. And that is, that's a major part of the recipe for success.
Yeah. And it's also because you have a very successful company. And I think it's a company that people should strive to get to, and often don't have the ability to do the programs that you do. And so that's my personal journey and goal, is to help people get the level of excellence that you have at a lesser cost, because a lot of organizations can't afford to do what you all do. It's an investment. It really is. And it's important investment because it's important in the health and safety and life of your employees. And there's nothing more important than that. But it's hard when you have a bare minimum to be profitable as a company and to keep employees employed. Right. So, I mean, at the end of the day, you don't have to worry about their safety if you can't afford to keep them. So, well, David, thank you so much. And I am excited to have another chat with you. And if you're ever in the Phoenix area, I would love to take you out for a round of golf or whatever it is that you enjoy to do for fun.
All right. Appreciate you having me on, Michael.
My pleasure.
That's it for today's episode of the Canary Report. If this conversation helped you reframe how you think about risk and safety, please do me a favor. Hit subscribe, leave a review, and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. We're building a new category of safety and risk leadership, one that's faster and smarter. Leaders who aren't just empowered by tech, but whose wisdom is accelerated by it. To learn more about how Yellowbird's cutting-edge platform is empowering leaders to solve workplace safety and risk challenges faster, smarter, and at scale, visit goyellowbird.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Yellowbird pages to stay up to date. Until next time, lead with clarity, know first, and act fast.